Vladimir Putin took time out of his schedule today to actually have a conversation, not just to answer questions, but to give an actual very detailed description of the battlefront as he sees it in the Ukraine war. There's been a lot of news here of late that Zelensky has offered some new terms that he wants to limit the fighting only to the 4 oblasts that are a part of what the Russians said a couple of years ago they want, instead of I think there's about 7 or 8 different ones where there's some fighting going on now, and kind of have a sort of semi-ceasefire. President Putin, first of all, just dismissed that, but then he went into some detail about how he sees each of the areas of the battlefield, the key ones especially. The question is he just giving a good spin on things, or are things really going as well for the Russians as he seems to think on the battlefront? There is literally nobody better we can try to have to assess the truth of this. And Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst specialist, also a former Secretary of Defense expert or advisor, and highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, listen. Let's just get right into the first one here, because Putin's going to go in. Really, he talked about a number of things, but there are 3 main areas he's talking about. One up in Sumi in the north, one in Kupyansk in the northeast, and then there's also the kind of the center, the big part of the entire eastern front is in the Slaviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration, where they have kind of fortress cities. And so we're going to take a look at each one of those. Here's what he said, first of all, about the Sumi area in the north.
Let us start from the north, namely with the north grouping. Let me remind you that the goal for Russian troops in the Sumi and Vovchansk directions is to create a security zone along our borders. This task was set after the AFU invasion of Kursk region and the continuing attacks on our border areas. The Ukrainian regime will pay for its crimes on Kursk soil with the loss of territory that we need to create a security zone in the border areas. A small city, in my opinion, more than 30,000 buildings. About 10.5 kilometers remain to the city of Sumi.
Now, this one here sounds as much punitive as it does tactical, in that he wants a security zone, because it sounds like it's punishment for what happened in the Kursk region over about a 7 or 8 month period, started, I think, in 2024, 2025. How important is that for the conduct of the war overall for Russia?
Actually, I would argue it's more strategic. There's an understanding that's begun to set in with President Putin, I think, that the territory has to be sufficient, that there is no threat to Russian soil. So he's got to press further to the west and further towards Kiev. And effectively, that's what he's doing in Sumi. So it's not a question of, well, we're going to punish you by taking your territory away. No, we're going to guarantee our security by holding this territory and preventing you from using it as you wish. If you go back and remember that particular incident, the area into which the Ukrainians attacked was really devoid of people. You know, you had vast stretches of forest and woodland, very few villages, and almost no military strength whatsoever. So it was a great choice if you were trying to make a splash, which is what the Ukrainians have been doing now for the last 3 years, and try to create the illusion that somehow or another you're winning something. There really wasn't much for them to win, and they expended a lot of manpower and capability for nothing. But the lesson was taken on board by the Russians. If we're going to get out of this war with what we fought for to begin with, we're going to have to secure it. And that means we're going to have to secure it with more territory than originally anticipated.
And Gary, if you could bring up that map of the Sumi area, you see that that's Sumi kind of in the center, in the golden area, in the lower left-hand corner of it. But you see all the red stuff, and that's what Russia has taken. Initially, they took a lot of that in the short time after they drove the Ukraine side out of the Kursk Oblast in Russia. Then they started moving in, but then they kind of went to, I don't know if they went to ground, but it didn't go very far. Now it seems that they're pushing again. Is this because Russia couldn't go further before, or was it a decision that they made and now they're going to try to push further?
Well, I think you're talking about moving large numbers of forces around over a very, very large area. I mean, this is sort of like a front that stretches from, Ohio all the way to the Atlantic coast. And you're making decisions about where you want to concentrate and how much force you want to apply in what area. At the same time, you want to rotate forces. You want to keep them fresh, well equipped. You want to replace losses, and you also want to return to duty any wounded. Dan, when you go through this is a major war in a scale that we haven't seen since 1945. This may not be as large as the Nazi-Soviet war, but you have many of the same problems, which really amount to distance, infrastructure, logistical support, surveillance, security. All of those things play into this. So I would not read this, as I said before, as punitive. I would see this as a strategically necessary move. And this is not the end by any stretch of the imagination, as I think we'll find as we go through the rest of these.
And so the first real question, can the Ukraine side prevent Russia from moving all the way up and taking Sumi, which he said, I think is about 10 or 12 kilometers still further?
No, of course not. You'll hear these silly, well, listen, we should talk a little bit more about this later on, but whenever you see the chorus of globalist voices, academic, political, military, whatever they happen to be in the West, that begin to come on with the nonsense, well, Ukraine is winning, and this is now a golden opportunity to throw back the Russians. Well, the situation is actually quite hopeless. And the reason they've all been sent out there to say this nonsense is to hopefully convince Donald Trump to send $90 billion to Ukraine. And the real tragedy here is that I think Trump is being more easily beguiled by the Europeans in this nonsense than he should be. This thing is over. The only thing that keeps it going, it's like handing somebody sort of cups of gasoline to put enough into the engine to keep it idling. And it's not going to idle much longer. I mean, that's effectively the truth. But, you've got plenty of people in academia, people like Kotkin and Ferguson and others who are only too happy to talk about, the Ukrainians are winning. Or bring back Dave Petraeus, now the newly anointed expert on drones and unmanned systems, and how these
self-anointed, I'll say.
Yeah, well, whatever, And of course, all these people are in this together. They're all benefiting from it financially and have been for several years. That's all. And they're lying, to be blunt.
So let me. How do you explain people like, and we'll say General Ben Hodges? And you actually sent me a video the other day. I wish I had thought to cut it and put it in here, but he's like really going all out and saying, "No, we have turned the tide." I mean, there has been a change of an inflection point, and now things are going in Ukraine side, and they're going to take back Crimea. What do you account for that?
The Confederacy is marching on Gettysburg and will soon be on its way into Philadelphia. I mean, that's about it. I think it's ridiculous nonsense. Here's the problem that Putin confronts. It's a huge problem. And I think he's finally beginning to come to terms with it. He should have much earlier. And, I think very highly of the Russian leadership, but I think this is a serious problem. If you tell people the truth and say, look, there's no massive movement of Ukrainians anywhere. They're not regaining anything. They're taking terrible losses. The place is on its last legs. It's on the verge of collapse, and the Russians are advancing. Then they say, well, why haven't they just marched west at high speed? Well, the president of Russia really doesn't want to conquer that territory. He doesn't want to administer it. He's only interested in those areas that are historically Russian and are populated by Russians. Well, I don't believe that. I mean, if he had the ability to do this, he'd have done it. And because he hasn't done it, he doesn't have the capability. Now, stop and think about that. That's really the argument. It's like a lot of people standing on the ridge line, yelling and screaming at people down in the valley. You people down there have no guts at all. If you have any guts at all, come on up and get us. And at some point, people in the valley say, we've had enough of these idiots. We're going to go up there and get them. But it hasn't happened yet. At least we don't think it has. So that's really the Hodges argument. That's the Petraeus argument. That's the Lindsey Graham argument. If they could have done it, they would have. If they haven't done it, they can't. Well, that's not true.
And why isn't that true? Because I hear that a lot in Washington, D.C., among even some people who are otherwise kind of balanced in their view. They say that exact same thing, because they say, you said a year ago, talking about something that I said, that the Ukraine army could finally just collapse, and yet it never did, and Russia never has moved on there, ergo they can't. Why do you say that's not accurate?
Let me go back to another analogy. In 1943, people said, well, the Soviets have gone as far as they can get. They can't go any further. In fact, the senior leadership in the German armed forces kept insisting that they just didn't have the logistical support, the mobility. And so these various offensives exhaust themselves over this great territory. Then we can attack, regain control of it. But they neglected to point to something, and that was American Lend-Lease. We had provided billions and billions of Lend-Lease in enormous quantities, all sorts of metals, locomotives, but most important, hundreds of thousands of trucks and jeeps and so forth. In fact, when the Germans reached Stalingrad in 1942, they were shocked to see all this American military equipment sitting around that the Russians had ridden in to Stalingrad on. The Russians, at the time, the Soviets, carefully edited all the film to ensure that none of the American equipment was ever shown to any of the audiences inside the Soviet Union. But the truth is, it was very important. It took a while for the Germans to come to terms with reality. And I think that Putin has made a terrible mistake. Let's put it very bluntly. He has held back too long in the hopes of a negotiated settlement. He needs to realize there will be no negotiated settlement. That means he needs to advance. And anytime you read any of the Russian newspapers, read the Russian media, listen to the Russian military experts, they all say the same thing. We have all the forces we need. We have all the equipment we need. We have all the ammunition we need. We can do this. Let's do it. Get this over with. President Putin has not yet decided to do that, and he is still in command. And until he does, you're going to see these incremental advances, but nothing spectacular. And unfortunately, it's the spectacular breakthrough and advance that is required to wake people in the West up.